Happy Monday and welcome to another episode of the Religious Studies Project. I'm Bree Fallon and with me is...
Dave McConaughey, not unfortunately at the AIR where I probably should be since it is the weekend and the week before Thanksgiving. Bree, we have missed a lot of conferences, have we not, this past year?
We have missed so many conferences. Normally we would have episodes coming out of the AAR, the BASR, the EASR, and of course this year was supposed to be the IAHR, which happens every 5 years. That was supposed to be in New Zealand this year, which we have sadly missed. But we actually have an episode today from a conference that actually occurred about 12 months ago. So it's wonderful to be hearing an episode out of a conference again. What do we have coming up today, Dave?
Yeah, today we have something that was recorded in Budapest at the Imperial Mysticisms Conference. It was recorded by Sidney Castillo, speaking with Carsten Wilke about politics, Kabbalah, and beyond, Jewish studies and the study of religion. Take it away.
So, it's after a long week of discussion last week in the conference Imperial Mysticism here at CEU Budapest. Now I'm sitting down with Professor Carsten Wilke from the Center for Religious Studies at the same university. Professor Wilke, it's very nice to have you here in the Religious Studies project.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation. I'm a faculty member of the CEU History Department and the Department of Medieval Studies. I am teaching in particular in the Jewish Studies specialization that we have at CEU, and I'm presently the director of the Center for Religious Studies. So my field of specialization is Jewish history, in particular Jewish religious and cultural history from the Middle Ages to the modern period.
Excellent. Indeed. Now we have many coverage to do because so far in the website we don't have anything featured about Jewish studies, so we hope that you will be our introduction to the field in some way. So without further ado, I would like to ask the following question. What does the field of Jewish studies encompasses? How is it approached by different disciplines?
So Jewish studies is established in a number of universities around the world. It is one of the classical area studies. That means a discipline that is not defined by its particular approach, like sociology, but by its object. That means the Jewish culture, the Jewish people, the Jewish religion, however you might define it, through history. And we have here an object that crosses human history through a large number of millennia from the Bible till the present day. This is something peculiar that has practically no geographical limits. And that has been defined, as I alluded to, in different ways through history. We have an ethnic definition in antiquity. We have mainly a cooperative definition in the Middle Ages, a religious definition in classical modernity, and through Zionism, and now a national definition as well. So we have an object that is changing, and this is the particular challenge of Jewish studies, that we have to span a large chronological width. We have to span geography to a large extent, and also we have an object whose self-definition is changing over history. So that the definition of Jewish studies as area studies is in a way problematic. It is not like Islamic studies, for example, which has a much clearer definition with respect to the religious message of Islam. But we have, in a way, a challenge that needs to be solved from the point of view of the different approaches that we need in this field. That means we have a cultural tradition that very much is based on written culture, on texts, on the biblical tradition and exegesis, as well as on legal traditions. So we have a basis in philology. We have a tradition that has expressed itself mainly in diaspora history. So there is a sociological fact of minority history that needs to be taken into account. And we are dealing with a cultural tradition that has not had, for the largest part of its history, a political center. That means that ethnographic expressions, that cultural traditions are much more important for the larger part of Jewish history than political and, for example, military history, a centralized cultural language, and so on. So Jewish studies, I would say, can not be defined by its area alone, because this area is very, very broad and very discontinuous, but also by a specific approach that marries philology to sociology and ethnography.
Exactly. So it's problematic in itself to try to study Jewish history or Jewish communities, because oftentimes it doesn't overlap the religious identity with the ethnic one, contrary to what happens in Islamic studies. Would you say that's a difference between the two as well?
So the creation of the Jewish collectivity predates our concepts of religion and ethnicity, of nationality, of course. So the question of whether Judaism is an ethnicity or a religion is a wrong question, I would say, because we are dealing with a tradition that has gone through a number of phases, that has had to define itself as a diaspora tradition with respect to the mainstream ideas of religion and of nationality, but which cannot be defined entirely with respect to one of them. Islam, for example, arose at a moment in which the late antique concept of faith, of salvation, of religious community, even of the Christian church, existed already, and formed this community, shaped it to a large extent, while Judaism is very largely defined by its biblical precedents, which have been active all through its history, that are, as we all know, much older than this late antique conception of religion, and that have resisted it over the ages.
Exactly. So to try to delve more into the subject matter, I would like to ask that, and based on your research, is situated within the history of Jewish communities in Europe from medieval to modern times. How can we understand their role throughout European history? I think it's a very broad question, but to situate a little bit for what you have been doing so far will be useful for us.
So I have been interested in particular in the interaction of the Jewish diaspora community with the environing religions and cultures. So my focus has been on Jewish-Christian relations, on the way in which Jews in a Christian majority environment have come to define their own tradition and specificity, and with the way also in which Jewish norms, Jewish legal and cultural patterns have adopted influences, elements from outside, and made it a core element of one's own cultural definition. So, to give an example, I've been working on the reform of the rabbinate in the period of the emancipation between the late 18th to the middle of the 19th century, in which the position and the cultural profile of the modern rabbi came to be defined with respect to the 19th century academic ideal of critical academic scholarship, and in which a very peculiar synthesis between traditional Talmudic learning and exegesis inherited from medieval and early modern Judaism, and the specific German tradition of historicism took place in a number of quite innovative conceptions. And what I study is the sociological composition of a new elite. Mm-hmm. And I have been interested also in the spread of this ideal of the Jewish religious authority, the spread of it from Central Europe to other parts of the world, the United States, for example, Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Particularly, there has been it's quite known the case of Jews in Spain during the 15th, 16th century. You have done research about that as well. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that?
So that is another period in European Jewish history that I have been very much interested in. It is perhaps an extreme case of Jewish-Christian relations, mm-hmm. When a large number of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, we're speaking about tens or hundreds of thousands, were forced to convert to Christianity, mm-hmm. but were not fully accepted in Christian society, mm-hmm. and due to social prejudice, also to the sociological dynamics of such a large group, and were able to develop their own religious tradition, clandestine, largely within the Iberian countries. Mm-hmm. They had sometime in 15th century Spain and in early 16th century Portugal, mm-hmm. in which this tradition could develop without persecution. Then the Inquisition arrived in these both countries, and clandestine Judaism among the so-called conversos, the converted Jews to Christianity, played an important role in shaping their self-perception. That means that the Jewish religion, as it was perceived by the conversos, which was much more focused on faith than on practice. Mm-hmm. And when these parts of these populations went to exile, fleeing the Inquisition, coming to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to France, to the Netherlands, to England, building up a network of communities, which was at the same time an important colonial merchant network. Mm-hmm. At this moment, the definition of religion through faith stayed very powerful among those communities. So it was not cultural or everyday life traditions that formed and shaped Judaism, and this was often the case in the Middle Ages, but mainly the conviction of a certain form of religious principles. Mm-hmm. So they tried to defend Judaism in a dogmatic way, in a philosophical way, by finding out what are the ways of thought that distinguish Judaism from Christianity. And this gave rise to a large body of literature, partly printed, partly polemical, clandestine manuscripts, which is a literature that I'm very much interested in, because it takes over influences and patterns from Christian literature of this age of Reformation, confessionalization, interreligious polemics, and tries to put Judaism on the map of the incipient, pluralistic religious relationships in early modern Europe.
So we would say that there are like some identifiable main time frames or horizons throughout European history that the history of Jewish community have been very important and are also shaping the history of overall Europe.
This is right, and this has to do within Christianity, but within Islam as well, and the constitutive reference to Judaism within those religious traditions. So that whatever happens in Judaism becomes relevant for Christian religious thinkers, but also to some extent for religious life within the majority, because it connects to certain ideas that are inside the origins of Christianity and Islam themselves. Let's take an example, the influence of Kabbalah. When Kabbalah spreads in the Renaissance among Jews with the printing of Kabbalistic books, this becomes interesting for Christians as well, because this method of esoteric exegesis of the scriptures can be adapted with a certain philological, Hebraistic investment by Christian exegetes, intellectuals, theologians, to Christian theology as well.
Speaking of which, the history of Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula, we can also find traces over in the Americas, like your work based in Mexico as well, in Mexican archives. How has these articulations has happened in the influence from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas?
So I spoke about this very ambivalent religiosity within the Iberian converso population. That is, those Jewish populations that were forced to convert to Christianity. And what becomes important for Spanish and Portuguese America are especially the descendants of the Portuguese Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity in 1497. So this is very shortly before the Iberian conquest of the Americas. And many of the vice kingdoms in Spanish America became places of refuge for persecuted conversos after the establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal. They went there partly to remote places in which to which the Mexican Inquisition that had been founded there in the 16th century already could not so easily penetrate, so that certain communities that arose in various parts of the American hemisphere could more easily develop a social life than their mother communities in the Iberian countries. So we have there, especially in the 17th century, in the first half of the 17th century, in various parts of Mexico, especially in the northern parts and the more recent settlements of Europeans there, but also in the Andean regions. We have there communities by conversos who continue religious traditions inherited from Judaism, and that involve to some extent also local populations of Amerindian stock and Afro-Americans. So this is a population that is quite mixed, of many different origins, from three different continents, which is repressed in the middle of the 17th century by a cruel persecution by the Inquisition, which has the effect that most of these communities were extinguished, but which has also the effect that we know much about them through the archives of the Inquisition that for Mexico have been preserved in a large quantity. And after this persecution, there are in some remote places communities, family traditions that survive, which is particularly fascinating for Brazil, in which until the 18th century and even beyond, there are crypto-Jewish communities in very complex syncretistic relationships with the local communities of Christian but also of non-Christian origin that are in some cases remarkable by ethnography even today.
Perfect. So continue picking up what you said about the Kabbalah. I would like to ask the following. In the recent conference of Imperial Mysticism, Piety and Power in Early Modern Empires from a Kabbalah Perspective, held at CEU this last week as of December of 2019, you talk about the implications of the Jewish Kabbalah in political cosmology for the early modern period. Could you share some of your main findings in this regard?
So the main idea behind this conference came up in a conversation that I had with my colleague Dr. Ute Fallasch, who is a specialist of the history of Sufism, especially in northern India. And we remarked that there is a particular moment in the formation of the large early modern empires, the so-called gunpowder empires, in the latter part of the 16th century, which at the same time saw a spread of mystical spirituality. So this is clear for Sufism, that Sufi orders play an important role in the 16th century in all the Islamic empires. But practically at the same time, we have the large spread of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, from its new center in Ottoman Palestine. So the question that drove us to organizing this conference was, how could such a movement towards the internalization of religion take place during a moment in which political power was spreading over various continents, over various religious communities, in all religions, majority and minority alike. So the 1516, 1570s, which saw the spread of Kabbalistic spirituality from Safed, but also from Italy, where Kabbalistic literature was first printed and became to some extent popular among Jewish learned circles after having been for centuries along a esoteric tradition in very small circles. How could it be that this time was also the moment of the major spread of Christian mysticism in mainly the Spanish Empire? So we have these new orders founded by these important personalities, Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross in Spain, and then very rapidly all over Hispanic America, that play an important role in the mission, in the Christianization of large environments. But virtually at the same time, in the Balkans, in India, we see also Sufi Muslim orders that do very similar things, namely integrating populations from Eastern Christianity, from Hinduism, that either join the the ruling Islamic populations, or are ruled by them in a relationship that is often quite tolerant of local religious traditions. So the interpretation of the spread of Kabbalah has been since Gershom Scholem and other historians of Kabbalah very much focused on the concept of Jewish exile, of the Jewish expulsion from Spain in 1492, of the suffering of the exiles, which means placing Jews in a situation of political passivity, which is then solved by an intellectual, spiritual moment of creativity that tries to come to terms, to cope with this moment of political oppression through mysticism, through an internalization of faith, garnering moments of resistance. But if we look at these phenomena of Kabbalah in a larger perspective, in an interreligious framework, we see that precisely among those populations, namely Catholic Christianity, Iberian Catholicism, that was responsible for the persecution of precisely those Jewish exiles, we have the same phenomena of religious internalization, of religious spirituality in a mystic sense, so that the question of persecution and suffering is perhaps not enough to explain what happened in those communities. If you want, persecuting society and the persecuted exiles alike. So that we need probably a more comprehensive historical framework that has to do with a particular situation of empire building, early modern empire building, on a global scale. And this is the evolution that we wanted to discuss, and that we encouraged our colleagues to engage in from a number of geographical, of historical perspectives alike. So we managed to focus on a particularly important period in imperial history, namely the latter part of the 16th and the early years of the 17th century, where in all these different religious environments, we find a similar development, a similar rise of movements that from a concentration of inward-looking spirituality come to a spread of religions and populations that are in widespread regions on the periphery of these empires.
One of the things that you mentioned is that like this reformulation of Kabbalistic knowledge was done after the expulsion of the Jews from Iberian kingdoms, but they moved to the Ottoman settlements, and particularly Ottoman Palestine. Based on that, how was there was a dialogue between, or it was they were allowed to build settlements based on different religions? I mean, the Ottomans were confessionally Muslims. How was this relationship between different religious communities within the Ottoman Empire?
So the Sephardic Jews are a particularly interesting population insofar as they move between the two dominant empires of the Mediterranean region. So they come from Spain and Portugal. So those two countries that founded the first seaborne colonial empires. And they move to the rising empire in the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire, in which they occupy important functions in the economy, in the economic, the commercial development, the industry, especially textile industry, with technologies that they bring in from Europe. Also, for example, they are the founders of book printing in the Ottoman Empire. They have a certain role in the development of military technology, especially artillery, that with techniques that they bring in from Spain. And they also play a role in diplomacy and state administration through a number of important families that gain a role and influence at the court of the sultans. Mm-hmm. So this led to a reflection, also to a self-reflection on the position of Jews and the Jewish community in the conflict between those empires. Mm. And quite a number of those Spanish Jewish leaders established in the Ottoman Empire take a very pronounced pro-Islamic and anti-Christian stance. Mm-hmm. That means that even though in their own culture they are, as I said, very much influenced by the Christian Reformation and counter-Reformation environment, they take sides with Islam where their protection as a minority community is much better guaranteed as in the Iberian environment, mm-hmm. which is based upon religious unification. Mm-hmm. So in my reading of Kabbalistic text, I claim that this also shapes the way in which esoteric cosmologies see the origin and successive creation of the world, that the experience of a change of power, of a translatio imperii, that means a shift of political power from one imperial tradition to another. All this plays a role in the Jewish self-perception as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's also a repercussion, as you mentioned, in the Kabbalistic text, but also how the reading of these texts for the posterior generations within the Ottoman Empire or within the same century, how was the reading of these texts impacted the way that they could relate to one another within this large society of the Ottoman Empire?
So this is if you refer to Kabbalah, as I suppose, mm-hmm. This is a process that takes a number of generations that pursued itself from its origins with the printing of the Zohar in the 1550s, 60s, to the outburst of the Messianic movement of Sabbat Tzvi, again in the Ottoman Empire in the 1660s, in such a sense that Kabbalistic spirituality, with its peculiar link between speculations on cosmology, on theosophy, and practices, new rituals, new ways of living together in study circles, in ritual communities. Mm-hmm. All this spreads out to larger parts of the Jewish population. And we're not speaking about the Ottoman Empire alone, mm-hmm. and its centers in Istanbul, in Salonika, in Ottoman Palestine, mm-hmm. but also across the borders of empire. Mm. So the peculiar development that takes place in the 17th century is that there is a spirituality that crosses community borders between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, but also between Jews living in the Ottoman Empire on the one hand and the Habsburg Empire on the other hand. Mm-hmm. So there is from the 16th century onward, a Kabbalistic school from in Prague and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, associate mainly with the figure of the Maharal, of Rabbi Löw of Prague, that practically at the same time receive certain traditions of Kabbalah that are new, that come from 16th century reflections, and that originated in Italy and in the Ottoman Empire. So we have there a certain koine of Jewish thought that is elaborated and that explains to some extent why a messianic pretender like Sabbatai Tzvi could have followers on both sides of the split European countries between Islam and Christianity.
Interesting. So we're almost at the time, but if you would like to give any concluding remarks for our interview, that would be great.
So the very impressive experience that I made personally in the conference in discussing with outstanding scholars specializing on so many different environments was that there is a challenge. There is a new challenge of developing concepts that can fit to observations made in disciplinary traditions that are quite far apart from each other, but that this challenge has, to a certain extent, its solutions and its concepts and ways of meeting it that can overcome certain artificial boundaries that we have in our academic life, especially those divisions between Islamic studies, Jewish studies, Christian history, and theology. That we are dealing with certain phenomena, especially the phenomenon of religious internalization in the 16th century, the reform of religious orders in a sense of spirituality that is common, but that cannot be adequately described with the concepts that we use, as for example mysticism or heterodoxy, religious reformation, and so on. That means that we have a terminology, that we have a certain span of scholarly expression that we need to define, that we need to adapt in order to make them fit as tools of communication between scholars in a global horizon. I had particularly interesting and fruitful conversations with a colleague from China who is studying the rise of Tibetan and Chinese Buddhism during a period in the late Ming Empire, that means again the late 16th century, and that was in the after the turn of the 17th century overcome by a renaissance of Confucianism. So that we have here a spread of a spirituality that can to some extent be compared to the mysticism that takes place among Christians, Muslims, and Jews farther west. But we cannot simply adapt our grid, our terminological grid, to these phenomena. But we should try to define our own criteria in order to describe those phenomena that are manifestly alike, that are contemporary, that are linked to empire, but that have not yet been described because the adequate terminology is still missing. And this is something that we hope to achieve and to accomplish in the coming discussions and I hope publications that we have decided to start at this occasion.
Excellent. I think it's a very good way for wrapping up the interview. We thank you again, Professor Wilke, for being with us on the RSP, and we hope to have you again soon.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this episode that Sidney and Carsten produced last year because it reminds me of just how expansive the study of religion is, and that those of us that work in particular area studies like Jewish studies, where we can have such a radically different set of conversations about what the issues are. This week we really have a treat because we have a response that came in already that we'll be posting because we are timely like that this moment by Jonathan Garb. And he had a line in the response that I wanted to share. Nothing less than Kabbalah's unique contribution is here, the sense that human action through the law not only mirrors, but actually shapes the form and destiny of the entire cosmos, including the divine world. Garb does an excellent job speaking about the kind of issues that Wilke raises about Kabbalah. And the thing that it made me think of is that we're so fortunate at this time to be able to reach across into these different areas and have conversations that would not have been possible previously. So that listeners all around the world can hear a perspective from Central Europe being interviewed by someone that is from another continent, being produced by people on two other continents, and every one of us in a slightly different configuration of religious studies. It just really, the academic study of religion is so diverse, and I'm just really thankful for the opportunity to kind of see all those different things intersecting themselves. Next time, though, what's up on the schedule, Brie?
Next week, we have the last discourse episode for 2020. Now, as always, I know it's sad, but they will be back in 2021, so do not despair. But as always, because we record the discourse episodes at the very last minute, so they are as relevant to the week in which they come out as possible, I can't tell you who is in it or what they are talking about. So you'll just have to tune in to hear who is on it and what they will be speaking about. So we will see you on the other side of that discourse episode, but we hope you enjoy that particular episode for the last one of 2020. But until then, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR and the IAHR and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's the other guy. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Lauren Osborne, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, podcast transcription by Andy Alexander and Savannah Finver, and social media managed by Ray Radford and Candice Mixon.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our Amazon affiliate links or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.